The winter of 1891 came to the village of Verkhnaya Tunguska like a knife through flesh. Sharp, sudden, merciless. The people of this remote Siberian settlement had weathered countless winters before, huddled in their wooden izbas while the taiga groaned under mountains of snow, but this winter felt different. The old women whispered that something ancient had awakened in the forest, something that should have remained sleeping beneath the permafrost forever. They were right, though by the time anyone understood why, it was already far too late. My name is Dmitry Volkov, and I am the last keeper of this story. I write these words by candlelight in a monastery cell in Krasnoyarsk, my hands trembling not from age but from memory. I am 73 years old, and I have spent 52 of those years trying to forget what I witnessed in that forsaken village. But some memories cannot be buried, no matter how deep you dig. Some horrors follow you across decades, across continents, across the very threshold of death itself. This is one such horror. The story begins not in 1891, but 12 centuries earlier, in the year 691 of the Common Era. Back then, Siberia was not the frozen wasteland that modern maps suggest, but a realm of endless mystery where the borders between the natural and supernatural remained thin as morning mist. The native peoples who inhabited these lands before the coming of the Russians knew secrets that have since been lost to time, wisdom carved from centuries of living alongside forces that defy rational explanation. Among the Evenki people, there existed a legend so terrible that it was spoken of only in whispers, and only when absolutely necessary. They called it Amaroktul, which in their ancient tongue meant, the wolf of consuming darkness. According to their oral histories, passed down through countless generations, Amaroktul was not merely a wolf but something far older and more malevolent. It was a spirit of vengeance, a creature born from the rage of the forest itself when humanity first learned to kill more than it needed to survive. The legend said that in the deep past, when the world was young and animals could still speak to humans, there was a great hunter named Bakhtu. He was the finest hunter the Evenki had ever known, a man who could track a snow hare across frozen lakes and bring down bears with a single arrow. But Bakhtu's skill bred arrogance, and his arrogance bred cruelty. He began to kill not for food or survival, but for sport and glory. He slaughtered entire herds of reindeer just to boast of his prowess. He left carcasses to rot in the snow. He killed mother wolves and left their pups to starve in their dens. The forest spirits watched Bakhtu's cruelty with growing anger, and finally they could bear it no longer. They gathered in a sacred grove where the oldest trees touched the stars and pronounced judgment upon him. But death was too simple a punishment for such crimes. Instead, they transformed Bakhtu into the very thing he had hunted so mercilessly. They twisted his body into the shape of a massive wolf, larger than any wolf that had ever walked the earth. His fur became black as the void between stars. His eyes burned with an eternal hunger that could never be satisfied. His howl could freeze the blood in a man's veins from a mile away. But this was not the end of Bakhtu's punishment. The spirits cursed him to walk the earth until he had taken as many lives as he had wrongfully taken himself, but with a terrible condition: he could only hunt during the coldest nights of winter, when the temperature dropped below what a human could survive unprotected. Each life he claimed would sustain him for exactly 1 year, after which he would return to hunt again. If he failed to claim a life in any given winter, he would finally be allowed to die and pass into the spirit world. But if he succeeded, he would be condemned to return the following year, and the year after that, bound in an eternal cycle of hunting and killing. For 1200 years, the legend said, Amaroktul had never failed to claim his prey. The Evenki people developed elaborate rituals to protect themselves from the creature. They carved protective symbols into the doorframes of their winter homes. They burned specific herbs that were said to repel evil spirits. They never, under any circumstances, traveled alone on the coldest nights of winter. And most importantly, they never spoke the creature's true name aloud between the first snowfall and the spring thaw, for fear of drawing its attention. When Russian settlers began moving into Siberia in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Evenki tried to warn them about Amaroktul. But the Russians, with their Orthodox Christianity and their firearms and their unshakable belief in the superiority of their civilization, dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition. They cut down the sacred groves. They built their villages in places the Evenki had deliberately avoided. They hunted without respect for the old ways. And on the coldest winter nights, when strange howls echoed through the taiga, they told themselves it was just the wind, just wolves, just the isolation playing tricks on their minds. For the most part, they were left alone. Amaroktul was ancient and patient, and he had learned over the centuries to be selective. He would take one life each winter, no more and no less, always careful to choose victims whose disappearances could be explained away by the harsh Siberian conditions. A hunter who went into the forest and never returned. A traveler caught in a blizzard. A drunk who wandered out of the village and froze to death. The creature's intelligence was terrible and profound. He knew that if he drew too much attention, if he killed too frequently or too obviously, the humans would band together to hunt him down. And despite his supernatural nature, Amaroktul could be injured, could feel pain, could theoretically be killed if enough people worked together with the right knowledge and the right weapons. So he remained careful, remained patient, remained hidden in the vast Siberian wilderness, taking his single tribute each year and melting back into the forest like smoke. But in the winter of 1891, something changed. Verkhnaya Tunguska was a village of perhaps 200 souls, situated on the banks of the Podkamenia Tunguska River in what is now the Krasnoyarsk Krai. It was a hard place populated by hard people, fur trappers, hunters, a few farmers who coaxed meager crops from the reluctant soil during the brief summer months, and several families of exiled political prisoners who had been sent to this remote corner of the empire to live out their sentences far from civilized society. The village had a small Orthodox church, a general store, a blacksmith, and a tavern where the men gathered to drink vodka and complain about the weather, the government, and the general injustice of being born Russian. I was 19 years old that winter, the youngest son of Pyotr Volkov, the village blacksmith. My father was a bear of a man, with hands like iron clubs and a beard that grew wild and unkempt down to his chest. He had taught me his trade, though I showed little aptitude for it. I was a dreamer, more interested in the books that occasionally made their way to our remote village than in the practical work of hammering iron and shoeing horses. My mother had died giving birth to me, and my father had never remarried, pouring all his energy into his work and his drinking. We were not close, but we tolerated each other, which in Siberia was often the best one could hope for. The cold began in early November, which was not unusual. What was unusual was its intensity. By mid-November, the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Celsius and showed no signs of moderating. The river froze solid, thick enough to drive a loaded sleigh across. The trees cracked and groaned in the night, their sap freezing and expanding until the wood split with sounds like rifle shots. Wolves howled in the distance, but they sounded desperate, hungry, wrong somehow. The first death came on November 23rd. Mikhail Orlov, a trapper in his 50s, went out to check his trap lines and never returned. A search party found him 3 days later, frozen solid about 6 versts from the village. What struck everyone as strange was that Mikhail was an experienced woodsman, someone who knew the taiga as well as any man alive. He had survival supplies with him, matches, a knife, even emergency rations. Yet he had apparently made no attempt to build a fire or seek shelter. He had simply stopped in the middle of a frozen creek bed and died. When they brought his body back to the village, my father was asked to build a coffin, but the ground was frozen too hard for burial, so Mikhail's corpse was stored in an unheated shed to await spring. I helped my father move the body. And that was when I saw Mikhail's face. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His mouth was twisted in a scream that had never been completed. And there were strange marks on his throat, not quite wounds, more like burns, as if something intensely cold had gripped him there. "Don't speak of it," my father muttered when he saw me staring at the marks. Bad luck to question how a man dies in winter. But I couldn't stop thinking about those marks, or about the expression on Mikhail's face. What had he seen in those final moments? What had frightened an experienced hunter so badly that he had simply given up and allowed himself to freeze to death? 2 weeks later, on December 7th, Yekaterina Sokolova disappeared. She was a widow in her 40s who supported herself by sewing and taking in laundry. She had gone to the river to break ice for water early in the morning and never returned. This time there was no body to find. The ice where she had been breaking through was undisturbed, her bucket sitting neatly beside the hole. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The village began to talk. Old Vasilisa, who was said to be part Evenki and who remembered the old stories, started making crosses out of rowan branches and hanging them over doorways. She burned juniper in her stove until the whole village smelled of it. When people asked her what she was doing, she would only shake her head and mutter prayers in a language none of us understood. On December 19, Ivan Morozov, a young father of 3 children, was found dead in his own barn. He had gone out to feed his animals after supper and had not returned. His wife found him an hour later, sprawled in the frozen hay, his face locked in that same expression of terminal fear we had seen on Mikhail Orlov. But Ivan's death was different in one crucial way. There were marks in the snow around the barn, marks that looked like paw prints, except they were enormous, far larger than any wolf track should have been. And there was something wrong with the spacing of the prints, something that suggested an intelligence behind their placement. The village priest, Father Alexander, called a meeting in the church. He was a young man, only recently assigned to our remote parish, and he still had the idealism of someone who believed that faith and prayer could solve any problem. He assured us that there was a rational explanation for the deaths, that we were allowing superstition and fear to cloud our judgment. He suggested that there might be a pack of particularly aggressive wolves in the area, driven to desperation by the harsh winter. He led us in prayers for the souls of the dead and for our own protection. But old Vasilisa stood up in the middle of his sermon and spoke in a voice that silenced the entire congregation. "It is Immortal," she said. "The Ancient One has returned. I have heard his howl in the night. My grandmother told me the stories, and her grandmother before her. He comes in the coldest winters, when the veil between worlds grows thin. He takes one life to sustain him for another year. But this winter is different. This winter he is hungry beyond measure. This winter he will not stop at one." Father Alexander tried to quiet her, to dismiss her words as the ravings of a senile old woman, but the damage was done. The Evenki families in the village, those who had married into Russian families or who worked alongside the Russians, they knew Vasilisa spoke truth. You could see it in their faces, in the way they refused to meet anyone's eyes. They began making preparations to leave, to pack what they could carry and flee deeper into the taiga, to older Evenki settlements where the protective rituals were still remembered and practiced. The Russian villagers were divided. Some thought Vasilisa was mad. Others began to remember old stories their grandparents had told, stories they had dismissed as fairy tales meant to frighten children. The temperature continued to drop. It reached 50 below zero, then 55. The air itself seemed to crystallize, each breath burning the lungs like fire. We stopped going outside except when absolutely necessary. The village became a collection of separate islands, each family huddled in their own izba, venturing out only to get firewood or water. On December 27th, 3 more people vanished in a single night. Grigory Markov, a hunter. His son, Pavel, who was only 14. And Daria Kruglova, a young woman engaged to be married in the spring. All 3 had been in their homes when they disappeared. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply walked out into the killing cold of their own volition and were never seen again. The village descended into panic. Some families barricaded themselves in their homes, nailing boards across windows and doors. Others tried to flee, packing sleighs with supplies and heading south toward Yeniseisk, though it was a journey of several hundred versts through hostile winter conditions. Father Alexander locked himself in the church and prayed day and night, his voice hoarse from reciting liturgies. The tavern became a shelter for single men and widowers, all of them drinking to dull their fear and speculating wildly about what was happening. I wanted to leave. I begged my father to pack up the forge and head south while we still could. But he refused. "This is our home," he said stubbornly. "I will not be driven away by stories and fear. If there is something out there, it is just an animal. Animals can be killed." On the night of December 31st, New Year's Eve, my father decided to prove his point. He gathered 5 other men, all of them experienced hunters armed with rifles and knives and axes. They would go out into the forest, they declared, and they would track down whatever beast was responsible for these deaths and they would kill it. They would end this nightmare once and for all. I tried to stop him. I had a terrible premonition, a cold certainty that if he left the village that night, I would never see him again. But he pushed me aside with a rough hand and told me I was being a coward. "Stay here and tend the forge," he said. "When I return, we will have the hide of the largest wolf in Siberia, and maybe then you will learn what it means to be a man." They left the village just after sunset, 6 men on snowshoes, carrying torches and weapons. I watched them disappear into the tree line, swallowed by the forest and the darkness. Then I returned to our izba and waited. The temperature that night dropped to 60 below zero. It was the coldest night anyone in the village could remember. The world outside became utterly alien, utterly hostile to human life. You could hear the trees exploding from the cold, great cracks that echoed like artillery. The smoke from chimneys froze and fell as ice crystals. The wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human, almost like words if you listened too closely. And beneath it all, carried on that terrible wind, came another sound. A howl. Deep, resonant, ancient. It raised every hair on my body and set my teeth chattering with more than just cold. It was the sound of something that had been alive for longer than any human could comprehend, something that carried within it all the rage and hunger of 1200 winters. I did not sleep that night. I kept the fire roaring in the stove, burning through our carefully rationed wood supply without thought for tomorrow. I prayed, though I was not a particularly religious young man. I prayed to God, to the saints, to my dead mother, to any force in the universe that might be listening. And as the long hours of darkness crawled past, I began to understand with terrible clarity that my father was not coming home. Dawn came late in that Siberian winter, the sun barely clearing the horizon before beginning its descent again. When there was finally enough light to see by, I pulled on every layer of clothing I owned and ventured out into the village. The cold was stunning, absolute, a physical force that tried to strip the life from your body the moment you stepped outside. My eyelashes froze together. My breath created clouds of ice crystals that tinkled as they fell. The snow squeaked under my boots with a sound like mice screaming. The village was silent. No smoke rose from some of the chimneys. I knocked on doors and received no answer. Fear drove me forward, from house to house, and in each one I found the same thing, emptiness. Beds unmade, as if the occupants had simply gotten up and walked away in the middle of the night. Food left on tables. Fires burned down to cold ash. No signs of violence, no signs of struggle. Just absence. By the time I made it to the church, I had counted 23 missing people, including Father Alexander. The church doors stood wide open, swinging slightly in the frozen wind. Inside, the icon lamps had gone out. The air was so cold that ice had formed on the walls, creating strange crystalline patterns that caught the dim light. Father Alexander's body lay before the altar. He was not frozen, not quite. He was kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, and there was an expression on his face of beatific peace, as if he had witnessed something so beautiful that dying had been worthwhile. But his eyes were gone, burned away by some terrible cold, leaving just frozen sockets that wept tears of ice. I stumbled out of the church and vomited in the snow, retching until there was nothing left inside me but fear. When I could finally stand again, I saw Vasilisa making her way across the village square. She was impossibly old, her face a map of wrinkles, but she moved with purpose, wrapped in layers of fur and wool that made her look like a walking bundle of rags. "You still live," she observed. "That is good. You must be the one to tell the story." "Tell what story?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What is happening? Where is everyone?" "Gone," she said simply. "Taken. The Ancient One is feeding. This is not his normal hunger, boy. Something has changed in the deep places of the earth. Something has woken him fully, brought him back to his full power. He is making up for centuries of restraint. He will consume this village entirely, every living soul, and then he will move on to the next settlement, and the next. He is becoming what he once was before the spirits bound him, a force of nature, unstoppable, insatiable. How do we stop him?" I asked desperately. She looked at me with eyes that held ancient knowledge and equally ancient sadness. "You cannot stop him. You can only survive him. You must leave this place now, before nightfall. Go south. Do not stop. Do not look back. And when you reach safety, you must tell this story. You must warn others. You must keep the memory alive, because memory is the only weapon we have against things that exist beyond time. Come with me, I said. She shook her head. I am too old for such a journey. I will wait here. Perhaps the Ancient One will grant me a quick death for keeping the old stories. Go now. You have perhaps 8 hours of daylight left. Use them. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she come with me, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She had already made peace with her death. So I did the only thing I could do. I thanked her, returned to my father's izba, and gathered supplies for the journey. Food, warm clothes, my father's best knife, matches, and one other thing, his journal. My father, for all his rough exterior, had kept a journal since he was a young man, recording his thoughts and observations in surprisingly elegant handwriting. I took it without knowing why, some instinct telling me that these pages contained something important. I left Verkhnaya Tunguska as the sun reached its pathetic zenith. I did not look back. I traveled south for 3 days and 3 nights. Pushing myself beyond the limits of human endurance, sleeping only in brief snatches when I could no longer take another step. The temperature remained brutally cold, but I was driven by fear greater than any physical discomfort. I ate snow and dried meat. I wrapped my feet in torn blankets when my boots began to fall apart. I walked until my legs were columns of agony and my mind began to play tricks on me, showing me shadows that moved in ways shadows should not move. On the 4th day, I reached a small settlement. I do not even remember its name. I collapsed in front of the first building I came to, and I woke up 3 days later in a warm bed, suffering from severe frostbite and exposure. The people of that village took care of me, nursed me back to health, though I lost 3 toes from my left foot and the tips of 2 fingers on my right hand to the cold. When I was strong enough to speak, I tried to tell them what had happened in Verkhnaya Tunguska. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They thought I had gone mad from the cold and the isolation, that I had invented a fantastical story to explain some ordinary tragedy. They sent word south to the authorities in Yeniseisk, reporting that there had been some kind of disaster in Verkhnaya Tunguska, possibly a disease outbreak or a fire. A party of investigators did not arrive until the following spring, when the ice had melted and travel became possible again. They found Verkhnaya Tunguska completely abandoned. Not a single living soul remained. There were no bodies, no signs of violence, nothing to suggest what had happened to the 200 people who had lived there. The buildings stood empty and silent. Animals had moved into some of them. Snow had blown in through broken windows. It was as if the village had been uninhabited for years rather than months. The official report concluded that the village had been abandoned due to harsh winter conditions and possible food shortages, and that the inhabitants had likely perished while attempting to reach other settlements. The report made no mention of the strange marks found on several buildings, marks that looked like they had been burned into the wood by something intensely cold. It made no mention of the broken icon lamps in the church, or of the strange arrangement of frozen objects in the village square that seemed to form a pattern, though no one could determine what that pattern might mean. I tried to tell my story to anyone who would listen. I wrote letters to newspapers, to government officials, to Orthodox Church authorities. Most ignored me. Those who responded suggested that I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown brought on by trauma and cold. I was young, they said. I had lost my father and my entire community. It was only natural that my mind would create elaborate explanations for what was simply a terrible natural tragedy. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince people. I moved to Kras Noyarsk and found work as a clerk in a government office. I lived quietly, attracting no attention. I married a kind woman named Anna who asked no questions about my past. We had 3 children. I built a normal life, or as normal a life as one can build when one carries such memories. But I never forgot. And I never stopped watching the newspapers for stories from remote Siberian villages, especially in winter. Over the years, I have collected dozens of accounts. A village near Lake Baikal where 15 people disappeared on a single night in 1903. A hunting camp in the Siberia Mountains where every member of a 12-man expedition vanished without a trace in 1911. A mining settlement in the Kolyma region that was found completely abandoned in 1923, all the residents gone, food still on the tables, fires still burning in the stoves. The details vary, but the pattern is always the same. Remote location. Coldest nights of winter. People vanishing without a trace or found frozen with expressions of absolute terror. And always, if you dig deep enough into local folklore, you find whispers of an ancient predator, a wolf spirit that hunts when the temperature drops below human survival, a creature that has been taking its tribute for over 1,000 years. My father's journal provided the final piece of the puzzle, though I did not understand it for many years. In his careful handwriting, he had recorded folk tales and legends he had heard from Evenki traders and trappers over his 30 years in Siberia. One entry, dated 3 years before my birth, described a ritual that the Evenki claimed could bind or even potentially destroy immortal. It required specific herbs that grew only in certain sacred groves, specific words spoken in the old tongue, and most crucially, it required the willing sacrifice of someone who carried the blood of both the hunter and the hunted, both Russian and Evenki, someone who could bridge the worlds and speak to the ancient spirits with authority. The ritual, my father had noted, could only be performed on the night of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. It required the ritualist to go into the deep taiga alone, to call the ancient one by its true name, and to offer a choice: take the life of the ritualist and be bound for another 100 years, or refuse and face dissolution by the combined power of earth and sky, forest and ice, old gods and new. My father had written, in what appears to have been a moment of dark humor, that such a ritual would require either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity, and that he hoped no one would ever be desperate enough to try it. I am now 73 years old. My wife has passed. My children are grown and scattered across Russia, living their own lives. I have perhaps 5 years left if I am lucky, perhaps 10 if I am very lucky. My body is failing, riddled with the cancers and ailments that come with age. I am, as the young people say, living on borrowed time. And so I have decided. This winter, when the solstice comes, I will return to the site of Yakut-Turkic. I have spent the past 2 years collecting the herbs, learning as much of the old Evenki language as I can, preparing myself mentally and spiritually for what must be done. I discovered, through research into my mother's family line, that she had Evenki ancestry several generations back, which means I carry within me the necessary blood to perform the ritual. I do not expect to survive. Indeed, the whole point of the ritual is that I will not survive. But if there is even a chance that my death can buy another 100 years of safety from this ancient evil, if there is even a possibility that I can spare other villages the fate that befell Yakut-Turkic, then it is a death that has meaning. I am writing this account and leaving it with the abbot of this monastery. I have instructed him to make copies and to distribute them to universities, to folklore researchers, to anyone who might listen. I do not expect anyone to believe it. But perhaps, somewhere in the future, someone will read these words and remember. Perhaps when the next cycle comes, 100 years or 500 years from now, someone will be prepared. Someone will know the truth. Knowledge, after all, is the only immortality any of us can truly achieve. The creature that haunts Siberia, that has haunted it for 12 centuries, is not merely a wolf. It is a reminder of older times, when humanity was not the undisputed master of the earth, when there were powers in the wilderness that demanded respect and sacrifice. It is a punishment for arrogance, for cruelty, for the belief that we can take from nature without consequence. Baktu the hunter learned that lesson 1200 years ago, but his punishment has extended far beyond his own existence, touching the lives of countless innocents across the centuries. I think about him sometimes, the man who became a monster. Does he remember his humanity? Does he suffer from the knowledge of what he has become? Or has he been subsumed entirely by the curse, becoming nothing more than hunger and instinct wrapped in supernatural power? I do not know. I suppose I will find out soon enough. The winter solstice is 3 weeks away. I have made all my preparations. I have said my goodbyes, though my children do not know they are goodbyes. I have made peace with God, or as much peace as a man can make when he is about to deliberately walk into the embrace of a primordial evil. I am not afraid. Or rather, I am terrified beyond measure, but I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to act despite it. Tonight, I sit in this monastery cell and I remember. I remember my father's face as he left on that final hunt, the stubborn determination in his eyes. I remember old Vasilisa standing in the snow, telling me to run. I remember the silence of Verkhnaya Tunguska that terrible morning, the empty-ness more profound than any sound could have been. I remember every person who vanished, every face, every name. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told, even if no one believes it. The wolf that haunts Siberia is real. It has killed for 1200 years, and it will kill for 1200 more unless something stops it. I intend to be that something, or at least to try. When the solstice comes, when the longest night of the year descends upon the taiga, I will speak the old words and I will call the ancient one to me. I will offer my life in exchange for the lives of those who will come after. And perhaps, in that final moment, I will finally understand what Mikhail Orlov saw in his last seconds, what terror and wonder exist in the eyes of something that has existed beyond time. If anyone reads this account and dismisses it as the ravings of a mad old man, I cannot blame them. We live in an age of electricity and telephones, of railroads and industry. There is no room in such an age for ancient curses and wolf spirits. But the taiga does not care about our age or our certainties. The taiga remembers what we have forgotten, that there are older laws than the laws of men, older powers than the powers of science and reason, older debts that must eventually be paid. I go now to pay one such debt. I go willingly, clear-eyed, with no illusions about what awaits me. And I go with hope, fragile and stubborn as a candle flame in a blizzard, that my sacrifice will mean something, that the 1,200-year-old wolf that haunts Siberia can be bound once more, that future generations will walk through winter forests without fear of vanishing into the cold and the dark. To those who come after, I leave this warning and this wisdom: respect the old places. Remember the old stories. Listen when indigenous peoples speak of the spirits that dwell in the land. And on the coldest nights of winter, when the temperature drops beyond what seems possible, when you hear a howl that raises every primitive instinct in your body, do not go outside. Bar your doors. Burn your protective herbs. Say your prayers, whether to God or to older powers. And wait for dawn. Because somewhere in the vast Siberian wilderness, beneath the frozen stars, the Ancient One still hunts. And he is always, always hungry. The monastery bells tolled midnight as I sealed the first portion of my account and began the second chapter of this confession. My candle has burned low, but I have many more, and the night stretches endlessly before me like the Siberian winter itself. There is more to tell, so much more, and I find that once the floodgates of memory have opened, they cannot easily be closed again. I must go back further than I initially intended. I must tell you about the weeks leading up to that terrible winter, about the signs we ignored, about the warnings that went unheeded. Because the horror that consumed Verkhnaya Tunguska did not arrive suddenly, without precedent. It announced itself in 100 small ways, and we, in our arrogance and our ignorance, paid no attention until it was far too late. The autumn of 1891 was strange from the very beginning. The first snows came in late September, which was early but not unprecedented. What was unusual was the behavior of the animals. The reindeer herds that usually passed near our village during their autumn migration gave us a wide berth, traveling miles out of their way to avoid our settlement. The wolves, which normally kept their distance from human habitation, began appearing at the edges of the village in broad daylight, not threatening, not hunting, but watching. Just watching with their yellow eyes, as if they were waiting for something. Old Vasilisa noticed it first. She had lived in that region for nearly 80 years, and she knew the rhythms of the taiga better than anyone. She began spending her evenings carving protective symbols into pieces of wood, which she then distributed to anyone who would accept them. Most people took them out of politeness and then threw them away or used them for kindling. I kept mine, mainly because I felt sorry for her, and I carried it in my pocket without any real belief in its power. The hunting that autumn was terrible. Men would go into the forest for days and return with nothing, not because game was scarce, but because the animals seemed to have developed an uncanny ability to avoid hunters. Traps were sprung but empty. Tracks would simply vanish in the middle of clearings, as if the creatures had been plucked into the sky. Several hunters reported hearing strange sounds in the forest, sounds that were not quite animal and not quite human, something in between that made their dogs whimper and refuse to go forward. My father dismissed all of this as coincidence and superstition. He was a practical man, a man of iron and fire and hard work, and he had no patience for what he called old wives' tales and evenki nonsense. When I mentioned the strange behavior of the animals, he cuffed me on the ear and told me to focus on my work instead of on fantasies. But even my father could not explain what happened to the Petrov family in early October. The Petrovs lived about 3 versts outside the main village, on a small homestead where they raised goats and chickens. Konstantin Petrov, his wife Olga, and their 2 young daughters. They were a quiet family, kept mostly to themselves, deeply religious in the old way, with icons covering every wall of their cabin. One morning, Konstantin did not arrive at the village to trade milk and eggs as he did every week. This was unusual enough that several men, including my father, went to check on them. They found the cabin door hanging open. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Food was laid out for breakfast, though it had gone cold. The fire in the stove had burned down to ash. The beds were made. But of the Petrov family, there was no sign. The searchers spread out through the surrounding forest. They called the family's names until their voices were hoarse. They found nothing, no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where 4 human beings could have gone. The goats were still in their pen, bleating pitifully, hungry because no one had fed them. The chickens were in their coop. Even the family's dog, a large beast named Grom, was there, cowering under the porch and refusing to come out no matter how much he was coaxed. The consensus was that the family must have gone into the forest for some reason and gotten lost, though this made no sense. Konstantin knew these woods intimately. And why would they have left breakfast half prepared? Why would they have left their animals unattended? It was a mystery that had no satisfactory explanation, and so people did what people always do with uncomfortable mysteries: they invented explanations that made them feel better. Perhaps the family had been planning to leave and had simply abandoned their homestead in the night. Perhaps Konstantin had debts he had not mentioned. Perhaps there was madness in the family. But I remember Grom, that fearless dog who had once fought off a bear that had threatened the Petrov girls. I remember how he shook and whimpered under that porch, how his eyes rolled white with terror, how he snapped at anyone who tried to touch him. That dog had seen something, something that had broken his spirit entirely. Within a week, despite being well-fed and cared for by the villagers who took him in, Grom simply lay down and died, as if he had lost the will to continue living. November brought more strangeness. The temperature dropped faster and harder than anyone could recall. By mid-November, we were experiencing cold that should not have arrived until January. The elders in the village, those who had lived through 50 or 60 winters, said they had never seen anything like it. And with the cold came the sounds. At night, when the temperature plummeted and the stars burned with that peculiar intensity they have in deep winter, we would hear howling from the forest. But these were not normal wolf howls. They were too deep, too resonant, too filled with something that I can only describe as malice. The sound would make your bones ache. It would make your teeth hurt. It would creep into your dreams and poison them, so that you woke gasping and sweating despite the brutal cold. People began having nightmares. Not just 1 or 2 people, but nearly everyone in the village. We would wake in the dark hours before dawn, hearts pounding, convinced that something was standing just outside our windows, breathing on the glass, waiting for us to look. In the morning, we would sometimes find frost patterns on the windows that looked disturbingly like handprints, or like the outline of a massive canine head, though of course these were just random formations of ice crystals. At least, that is what we told ourselves. The children were affected most only. They began refusing to sleep, terrified of the dark, crying about the big dog that visited them in their dreams. Parents dismissed this as childish imagination, but I noticed that even the most rational adults began leaving lamps burning through the night, began finding excuses to avoid going outside after sunset, began speaking in hushed voices about things they had seen from the corners of their eyes, shadows that moved wrong, shapes in the tree line that were too large to be natural wolves, eyes that reflected lamplight from impossible heights. I began reading my father's journal during this time, partly out of boredom, partly out of a growing sense that the old stories he had collected might contain some truth after all. The journal was filled with his observations about life in Siberia, practical notes about metalworking and blacksmithing, but interspersed throughout were the folk tales he had recorded. One story in particular caught my attention. It was told to him by an Evenki shaman named Yakut-Turkic, who had been passing through the region about 15 years before my birth. Yakut-Turkic had warned my father that the region around Tunguska was what he called a thin place, a location where the barrier between the physical world and the spirit world was not as solid as it should be. He said that thin places attracted supernatural entities the way wounds attract infection, and that humans who settled in such places did so at their peril. According to Yakut-Turkic, Immortal was drawn to thin places because they allowed him to exist more fully in the physical world. In most locations, he could manifest only partially, only on the coldest nights, and only to hunt his single yearly victim. But in thin places, especially during winters of unusual cold, he could become more substantial, more powerful, more present. He could hunt more freely. He could take more victims. He could, in essence, become more of what he had been in the ancient past, before the spirits had bound him with their curse. Yakut-Turkic had performed a ritual at the time, he told my father, a ritual meant to strengthen the barrier between worlds and keep Immortal away from the village. But such rituals had to be renewed periodically, perhaps every 50 years or so, and they required someone who knew the old ways, who spoke the old languages, who could negotiate with the spirits on equal terms. Without periodic renewal, the barrier would gradually weaken, and the thin place would become thinner still, until it was little more than a membrane that anything could tear through. My father had written in the margin, "Old man seemed sincere but obviously superstitious." Nonetheless, his description of the binding points he established around the village was quite specific. He placed marked stones at 7 locations, one at each cardinal direction, one at the village center, one at the highest point in the vicinity, and one at the lowest. Says they form a protective pattern. Humor him by not disturbing the stones, though I cannot imagine they serve any real purpose. I closed the journal with shaking hands. 50 years before Yakut-Turkic had performed his ritual would have been around 1826. It was now 1891. 65 years. The protection, if it had ever existed, was long overdue for renewal. And Yakut-Turkic himself was certainly dead by now, along with anyone else who might have known how to perform the ritual properly. I took the journal to Vasilisa the next day. She was in her small cabin at the edge of the village, surrounded by bundles of dried herbs and pieces of carved bone inscribed with symbols I did not recognize. When I showed her the relevant passage, her wrinkled face grew even more grave. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know of Yakut-Turkic. He was a great shaman, a man who walked between worlds. His protection has been keeping us safe all these years, but I have felt it weakening. I tried to renew it myself, but I do not have the power. I am just a keeper of stories, not a true shaman. My magic is small, enough to protect a single house perhaps, but not an entire village." "What about the stones he placed?" I asked. "Are they still there?" Her face darkened. "That is the problem, young Dmitri. 3 years ago, when the new church was being built, they needed stone for the foundation. Some men went around collecting any large stones they could find. I tried to stop them, tried to explain, but no one would listen to an old Evenki woman. They took 4 of Yakut-Turkic's marked stones and broke them up for building material. The pattern is broken. The protection is broken. We are exposed." I felt cold run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Can it be repaired?" She shook her head slowly. "Not by me. It would require someone with Yakut-Turkic's knowledge and power. And even if such a person existed, they would need to perform the ritual during a time of balance, a time when the veil between worlds is thin but not torn. But we are past that time now. Winter has come. The Ancient One is already here. All we can do now is try to survive until spring, and hope that he returns to his old pattern of taking only one life per season." But even as she spoke, I think both of us knew that hope was futile. The deaths began in earnest after that conversation. I have already told you about Mikhail Orlov and Yekaterina Sokolova and Ivan Morozov. But there were others, so many others, and each death was stranger and more terrible than the last. Pyotr Gagarin, a woodcutter, was found frozen to death inside his own house, despite the fire in his stove still burning. His face was pressed against the window, and the glass had cracked from the intensity of the cold that had touched it, though there was no rational explanation for how cold could emanate from inside a heated house outward. Marfa Lebedeva, a grandmother of 70, vanished from her bed while her daughter slept in the same room. The daughter swore she had not been sleeping deeply, that she would have heard if anyone had entered the room or if her mother had gotten up. Yet when morning came, the old woman was gone, and the only unusual thing was that the air in the room smelled strange, like ozone after a lightning strike, and like something else, something organic and wild that did not belong in human habitation. 3 children went missing while playing in a barn in the middle of the day. Their friends, who had been with them moments before, reported that the children had simply walked into the shadows at the back of the barn and had not come out. When adults searched the barn, they found nothing, no secret doors, no places where children could hide, nothing. The children were simply gone, as if they had stepped through a door into another world. The village began to tear itself apart. Accusations flew. Some blamed witchcraft and wanted to burn Vasilisa as a witch. Others thought there was a madman among us, someone who was kidnapping and murdering people. Fights broke out in the tavern. Families who had been friends for generations stopped speaking to each other. The social fabric that held the village together began to unravel. Father Alexander tried to hold services, tried to provide comfort and spiritual guidance, but his words rang hollow. How do you comfort people with scripture when their loved ones are vanishing into thin air? How do you speak of a merciful God when children are being taken in the night? I saw the doubt creeping into his eyes, saw his faith beginning to crack under the weight of events that his theology could not explain. I spent those days in a strange state, hovering between terror and a weird sort of acceptance. I kept my father's journal with me always. I read and reread the pages about immortal, about the binding ritual, about Yakut-Turkic's warnings. I began to understand that what was happening was beyond human capacity to fight or prevent. We were insects caught in a web, and the spider was something ancient and patient and utterly without mercy. My father, meanwhile, grew more angry and more determined. He could not accept that there was something in the world that could not be solved by strength and courage and Russian stubbornness. He organized the hunting party not out of bravery but out of a desperate need to impose his will on a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. He needed to believe that he could kill whatever was out there, because the alternative, that there were forces in the universe that did not care about human determination or human weapons, was too terrible for him to contemplate. The night they left on that final hunt, I tried one more time to stop him. I showed him the journal, showed him his own words about Yakut-Turkic and the binding stones and the nature of immortal. He read the pages with growing irritation, then threw the journal back at me. "You have become infected with superstition," he said coldly. "Just like that old Evenki W. H. There is no such thing as spirits or curses or ancient wolf demons. There is only the world we can see and touch and kill. We are going to find a wolf, Dmitri, probably a very large wolf made bold by hunger and cold, and we are going to kill it. And tomorrow you will see how foolish you have been." Those were the last words my father ever spoke to me. I watched him and his companions disappear into the tree line, and I felt my heart break because I knew with the certainty of prophecy, that he was walking to his death. The night that followed was the longest of my life. I sat by the fire in our izba, unable to sleep, unable even to pretend to relax. Every sound outside made me jump. The howling wind, the cracking trees, and beneath it all, that terrible howl, that sound that was not quite wolf and not quite anything else, echoing through the frozen forest. Around midnight, I heard something else, gunshots. 3 of them, spaced perhaps 30 seconds apart, coming from deep in the forest. Then silence, so profound it seemed to absorb all other sound. I waited for more shots, for shouting, for any indication of what was happening. Nothing. Just the wind and the cold and the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. I must have dozed off despite my terror, because I woke suddenly around 3 in the morning to the sound of scratching at the door. My heart leaped. My father had returned. I rushed to the door and put my hand on the latch, but something stopped me. Some instinct, some primitive part of my brain that recognized danger, made me pause. The scratching continued, regular and persistent, like a dog asking to be let in. But we did not have a dog. And the scratching sounded wrong somehow, too deliberate, too rhythmic, as if whatever was making the sound was imitating scratching rather than actually scratching. "Father?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is that you?" The scratching stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard breathing on the other side of the door, deep and heavy, the breathing of something large. And beneath the sound of breathing, I heard something else, a low, almost subsonic rumble, like a growl played at half speed. I backed away from the door slowly, my eyes locked on the wooden planks as if I could see through them to whatever stood on the other side. The breathing continued for perhaps a minute longer, then stopped. I heard the snow squeak as something heavy moved away from the door. I heard it circle the house, slowly, deliberately, and I followed the sound by listening, tracking its progress as it moved from the door to the west wall to the back of the house to the east wall and then back to the front again. 3 times it circled the house. 3 times I stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching my father's knife, knowing that if that door opened, if that thing decided to come inside, the knife would be as useful as a toothpick. Then, finally, I heard it move away. Heard the squeaking of snow fade into the distance, and I was alone again. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I fed the fire until it roared, burning through what I could not afford to waste. I prayed every prayer I knew. And I waited for dawn. When light finally came, thin and gray, I forced myself to go outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I had to see. I had to know. In the snow around our izba, I found tracks. They were enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf track I had ever seen. They circled the house 3 times, exactly as I had heard. But there was something wrong with them, something that my mind struggled to process. The tracks were too deep for a normal animal, suggesting something incredibly heavy. And the spacing between them suggested a gait that was not quite animal, something that moved with an intelligence and purpose beyond instinct. At the front door, where I had heard the scratching, there were marks in the wood. Deep gouges, as if something with claws of steel had scraped against the door. But again, there was something wrong about them. They were too uniform, too deliberately placed, arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand more than a paw. I followed the tracks away from the house, compelled by a morbid curiosity stronger than my fear. They led toward the forest, toward the same direction my father and his hunting party had gone. About 100 paces from the village, I found something that made me stop cold. There was a rifle lying in the snow. I recognized it immediately as belonging to Boris Krupin, one of the men who had gone with my father. The rifle was broken, snapped cleanly in half as if it were made of matchwood rather than sturdy Russian steel. Around it, the snow was disturbed, trampled, stained with something dark that might have been blood, though it was frozen solid and impossible to examine closely. I did not go any further. I turned and ran back to the village, my breath coming in frozen gasps, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I knew that if I continued following those tracks, I would find things that would destroy what remained of my sanity,